In this episode of the Orange Nerd Show, we're talking all about DreamWorks. DreamWorks, the birth of this studio in its competition with the Walt Disney Company and their animation division. There was a lot going on here with DreamWorks. Fascinating animation studio. We're going to talk about it, break it down. We got Josh from Modern Mouse in the house with us today, up next on the Orange Nerd Show. Welcome aboard, everybody, to another episode of the Orange Nerd Show. Where today we're talking all about DreamWorks. Interesting conversation. George, the Italiano, I believe this topic was your idea today, actually.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much. Yeah, I brought it up to our good friend Jay Shear. I thought, because he's also a movie buff and what have you, and he shot me down like a first date. So it was like
he shot you down. He shot
me down. But he did recommend Josh join the conversation because he said this is his wheelhouse, and I'm like, I'll take your word for it. We'll have Josh on and talk about it because it was very interesting. Because I saw it was a video on YouTube, and they were talking about the differences and similarities, but not a coincidence between Pixar's A Bug's Life and DreamWorks Ants, of how they both were released around the same time, and they both kind of had this narrative of ants and a colony and living in a bug's world sort of thing. But there's a interesting story behind of why those two films came out. And as we say, OG, all the time, a coincidence is never a coincidence.
Exactly. Well, George, if you could let everybody home know where they can find you on social media before we dive in.
Absolutely. You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on Instagram under the Disney Italiano. And of course, you'll find me here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner, with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
There he is. And down below, we got Modern Mouse. We got Josh in the house. Josh, it is always fun having you on, brother. If you could let everybody at home know where they can find you on social media, your Twitter, YouTube, all that good stuff.
The main thing I'm doing these days is YouTube. So Modern Mouse. If you just want to check that out, youtube.com/Modern Mouse, or everywhere else you can follow me is at Modern Mouse Josh. I'm constantly posting on Instagram or TikTok, or I try and post on Twitter as often as I can, although I'm off and on with it these days. But yeah, definitely Instagram and TikTok for sure.
Absolutely. Make sure you follow him. Amazing content, amazing insight. And I will be linking his socials down below in the description. So easy access. Click on it and go ahead and follow and subscribe. So let's dive right in. So DreamWorks. Okay. So this is interesting. So in the 90s, Katzenberg left the Walt Disney Company, right? And they had a huge amount of success with Katzenberg. The Renaissance era and what have you. And he left, I believe it was in 94-ish, I believe. And he teamed up with Spielberg and David Geffen and created DreamWorks. Now, there was a whole lot of hype around that and what kind of studio is this going to be, and a lot of expectation that this thing could be real competition for Disney animation. You have some big players here. This is a big deal. Now, Josh, in your opinion, how did that whole thing pan out? So DreamWorks, the idea was birthed. They started doing animation. What are your feelings on this? The expectation versus what the studio actually became, ultimately.
Expectation at that time, I think, was interesting. I guess when you look at Hollywood history as a whole, right? I would say that there was a boom in the 80s and 90s. There were a lot of smaller studios or even bigger studios like a Disney that were creating smaller studios, like Touchstone, or they acquired Hollywood Pictures. But kind of what the big five, Paramount, Universal, all those were still around. And there were a lot of smaller production companies in town. And Steven Spielberg wasn't new to the game. He created Amblin Entertainment, and he had his hands on all kinds of projects, especially even in animation. He was a part of Animaniacs and Tiny Toons with Warner Brothers. And of course, was helping produce Roger Rabbit. So he'd had a connection to animation. David Geffen, I mean, wanting to spin off and do his own music thing. Steven Spielberg wanting to collaborate and do films, and then bringing on Katzenberg made sense so they could have more of an animation division of the, while Steven Spielberg did the live action. What's interesting about DreamWorks is out of all those things that they did, the animation department is the thing that I think DreamWorks, like when people think of the DreamWorks name, they usually now think of, Kung Fu Panda or Shrek or things like that. They don't think of any of the live action films or albums or whatever from DreamWorks. So I think that's really interesting. And I also find that it's quite possible that people were hungry for Disney to have competition. Disney for a long time had pretty much gone, during its renaissance anyway, had gone unrivaled. And so this is a chance to see like another production company kind of come up. And like Pixar was just rising up like at around that same time. So it was really interesting to see, which ones were going to take over or do better than Disney or fail against Disney.
Yeah, and it was interesting too, how initially DreamWorks really has evolved quite a bit, from its conception to like today, right? Because if you look at those early DreamWorks movies, they were really, you can tell they were really inspired or rooted in kind of like that Disney Renaissance era, like very reminiscent, I would say, of that, where like you had like Prince of Egypt and things like that, right? Where it's like, okay, this is something that we could see Disney doing, these epic animated, stories and stuff. And then as it went on with DreamWorks, it sort of started to become more, I guess you could say more Pixar-like, with a little more modern stories, things like that. And then now, it's owned by Universal, and they're kind of maybe a little bit more, I would say maybe a little bit more on the illumination side of things. So it's been a very interesting evolution. Now for you, George, what are your feelings on DreamWorks? How it started, expectation, where it is now?
Yeah, for me, it was because actually you had mentioned the Prince of Egypt, and from what I can recall, the Prince of Egypt was the first animated film that I've seen coming out of DreamWorks, at the time, where I didn't really think about it at the time. And it wasn't until Shrek kind of came into the picture where it was like, okay, now we got two studios that are kind of going head to head with the same kind of animation style, because up until that point, Disney, as Josh had mentioned, Disney was like the beast on the block when it came to animation. And then Pixar came and they kind of became their own kind of animation empire, with being the first CGI film of all time with Toy Story and what have you, which there was a lot of back and forth going there with Katzenberg as well, especially with the direction of how Woody would actually be, which I thought was very interesting. So at that time, when you look at those films, a lot of people weren't really paying attention to like studio brand names at the time. It was just, you would just looked at the film as the film. A lot of people, I think for a short period of time, they thought Shrek actually came from like Disney or Pixar, because all they were noticing was the kind of animation style, and then as time progressed, it was like, okay, no, this is Disney, this is Pixar, this is DreamWorks, and it started becoming a revolutionary thing with animation, because there was only 1 to 2 studios at the time that was doing computer animation. Now it's like that's all these studios do, whether it's DreamWorks, Disney, Pixar, Illuminations. That's all you see. You don't really see too much of a not necessarily hand drawn, but like the kind of 2D style. Yeah.
You don't see it, at least in terms of a mass production, like a huge studio doing it, right? Like,
correct.
You see some independent.
Right, exactly. And then especially with anime, it's right. Like, I mean, they say that 2D is out of style, but I mean, for the people that just go for the anime style, like from Hayao Miyazaki to like Demon Slayer and what have you, it's like these are like big brand, like anime style, and people don't even pay attention to the fact that it's 2D. They don't care, but yet at the same time they say, well, it's not really in style. And I really don't think that's the case. I think honestly it goes by story and character arc, to be honest with you.
Well, it's interesting too with DreamWorks how, like I was saying earlier, like how they kind of try to first with the first film out the gate, Prince of Egypt, they try to emulate the Disney style, but then they came out with Shrek, right? Which you were talking about, George, and Shrek was like, it was kind of, okay, some of the style of animation, I can see what you're saying, George. It kind of reminded a lot of Disney, right? But then at the same time, it was called the anti-Disney, right? Because Disney took their fairy tales very seriously, right? And then Shrek comes around, and everything's kind of a joke, and it's very snarky, right, Josh? It was a very different kind of thing.
It's the antithesis of what Disney or even Pixar at the time was doing, right? In the sense of, you're correct, like it took all of the tropes that you would see in a Disney film and said, no, not that. We're going to add in more adult-esque humor here. We're going to, instead of write our own musical numbers, we're going to, again, because DreamWorks had Geffen and they had a whole music library to choose from, we can get established artists to come in and we can just license out one of their songs. And so you're right. Like, I think like there was Ants, which does feel like a rip on Pixar. And then a couple others. There's Spirit. There's Road to El Dorado. A few others that are in there, but it isn't until Shrek that it feels like the style of what Pixar becomes after that is fully established. And I think by like the mid 2000s, the 2D stuff is gone. The kind of pseudo Christian films that they were doing are all gone. It's now we're just living in the world of like what Shrek is and beyond that. And they're also, DreamWorks was not afraid of sequels. I think that was something that Katzenberg was all about at Disney. And, they held him and said, against it. People at Disney were against it in the sense of they didn't want to do sequels. That's why the sequels that were made ended up being direct to VHS. But like, I think the Katzenberg saw the profits, the possibilities of profits in sequels. So it was like, here's Shrek 2, here's Kung Fu Panda 2, here's How to Train Your Dragon 2, here's Secret Life of Pets 2. Like, that's just become a staple of their brand.
Yeah, no, well said. Go ahead, George. I'm sorry.
Really quick, Josh, I wanted to ask you, because I asked this question to OG, and I was trying to figure out, during the time Katzenberg was part of Disney, during like the Renaissance era, when you look at those films like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and The Lion King, they have a prestige kind of notion to them where it's like you look at them today and it's like they're timeless, but it still wasn't to Katzenberg's way, obviously, because he had some thoughts and opinions of how he wanted Toy Story to go. He had thoughts and opinions, of how Pixar was moving forward, his exit out of the company, making DreamWorks, kind of digging at Disney with Shrek in some aspects. But that was a completely different kind of story arc than what he was doing with the Renaissance era. Was that at the time, do you know, Katzenberg's intentions, or did he still even have a difference of opinion with those films, or did he just kind of say, you know what, I'll go with it for right now, but eventually I want to get into these kind of stories that I want to tell?
Well, you kind of have to look at like where Katzenberg came from. Like him and Eisner both came from Paramount before Disney, and they both kind of came from like this idea of, make a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. And he also wasn't afraid. Katzenberg, I think, ultimately, and you see this as he jumps from Disney to DreamWorks, he wasn't afraid to like be a bit more contemporary. He wasn't so bothered by like the idea of these stories need to be a bit more timeless. They need to not like that's all of Disney's thing. Disney wants every film they do, kind of apart from Wreck-It Ralph. They want every film that they do to feel like, oh, this was made in the 1940s. I would have never imagined that. Like, right, this feels like it could be made today. Katzenberg never really cared about that. Like, he wanted just a film that was made that was as broad of appeal as possible. It's why his idea when they were doing The Little Mermaid was to cut the ballad, the part of your world ballad, because he wanted something flashy and fast and that felt contemporary, and to drag it down with like this Broadway musical number that was slow and quote unquote girly wasn't as broad appeal as he thought it could be. So when you jump to DreamWorks and you see the use of contemporary music, Shrek with like Smash Mouth, right? And you see like how much they rely on jokes that feel very contemporary. There's like a scene there. I always remember like the joke where like the gingerbread man is like super big, like Godzilla, and he's crushing through the town, and like there's a Starbucks across the street from another Starbucks, which is funny, but you know, it is not a timeless joke necessarily. But I think they also go off of the idea that because Spielberg had worked with Warner Brothers, and the way that Warner Brothers and Looney Tunes worked is that even though they weren't necessarily timeless, because they made reference to a lot of older stars and things like that, they realized, and I think what's good about it is like, I'm assuming all three of us grew up in a time where we watched Looney Tunes not firsthand, right? They'd been around for decades. We're all not like 90 years old. Those characters introduced me to the golden age of Hollywood stars in a way that I might have not known about those, you know, and like, you don't have to know who Humphrey Bogart is to get the joke when you're a kid, but like my curiosity is piqued and now I want to know who Humphrey Bogart is. For some people that just might not exist and they might just move on to the next thing. So it's an interesting way of like looking at it. You can either be timeless or you can choose to be contemporary in hopes that people will still think it's funny sometime down the line. I think that as time has gone on, they've DreamWorks in particular has found a really good balance of being contemporary with some of their films and being timeless with some of their films. How to Train Your Dragon feels a bit more timeless. It's a medieval story. The Trolls movies are a way to play contemporary music in a movie, and that is all that they are. So they don't feel nearly as timeless, but they're going to appeal to different people versus Disney, I think, wants to stick to what Disney is and try and just continue to be that versus branching out and trying a bunch of other things, which had been going back to his Paramount days, the long-standing tradition of Katzenberg, and he learned that from Eisner anyways.
Yeah, and that's very... Oh, sorry, bro. I was just going to say, and that's very true, especially when you speak to a film like Aladdin, because I feel like Aladdin kind of has like that dual kind of sensibility where it's like it is timeless but yet very contemporary, especially when it comes to the genie. And it's quite interesting because when you were saying like interpretations like of Humphrey Bogart and what have you didn't know about Humphrey Bogart, but it piqued the interest. Like at the time when I first saw Aladdin and Genie would do his interpretations of Jack Nicholson or Rodney Dangerfield or Groucho Marx. It's like at 2 to 3 years old, I didn't know who those people were, but it was like, it was still very interesting. And then as I got to know them as people and actors, and then going back and watching Aladdin, it's like, oh, okay, that was a reference to Dangerfield. That was a reference to Groucho. And it was like, that's very interesting.
Do you guys remember Rover Dangerfield, the animated?
Oh yeah. That's a whole different topic for another time. But yeah, like that, like those kinds of things, I think were a Katzenberg specialty, and or a Michael Eisner was also the head of there, so he wasn't just letting Katzenberg allow him to do anything. But the two of them, coming from Paramount, were interested in those type of references because they saw those in Looney Tunes growing up. They also weren't afraid of bringing in big stars like a Robin Williams. That wasn't the norm, prior to Eisner coming on board at Disney. Like the norm for the most part was to get older stars who didn't really do much stage acting or film acting anymore, bring them in to do a voice appearance, or have the slew of a dozen different voice actors that they had on hand at any given time to come in and do stuff. And that translated over to DreamWorks as well. So now you've got everything that Katzenberg learned at Disney, but he wasn't allowed to do some of those things. He brought all of that over to DreamWorks, and to their benefit, it worked.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I can see Disney's perspective with the timeless thing. Like at face value, I can definitely see it because you figure, okay, Disney, what they do is they have that, as JPEG called it, right? The flywheel.
Right.
And it's like you have this flywheel. So you create a movie, it goes into theaters, and after the theaters, it goes on to DVD. Then after DVD, you get the attraction or the show in the park. So these movies, from Disney's eyes, they have to have generational appeal because that thing will probably become an attraction at one of their parks, and that's, could last for decades, right? But it's interesting because I can also see the other perspective with the DreamWorks, the core modern stuff, because it has worked in the past. And even though technically, like you said, Josh, with like Looney Tunes and things like that, even when you don't recognize the thing, right? Like Humphrey Bogart or whatever, it's still fun and entertaining. So it's like, it's in this weird way, it is still kind of timeless, right? It's really bizarre. It's interesting. It really is.
I was having a conversation the other day with somebody about parody films, Scary Movie, Hot Shots, things like that, right? And how those films feel kind of like nobody's making them these days.
Yeah.
But they were, in a weird way, for me, like watching Hot Shots, I had not seen Apocalypse Now or Platoon before, right? But like all of a sudden, and I don't get the joke. I'm laughing, but like I'm not fully understanding of the joke. But like when you see, the Sheens cross paths in Hot Shots, and it's like, oh, they're referencing Apocalypse Now and Platoon and how both of them are similar types of films, and they're starring a father and son. And years later, it was like, oh yeah, that's a reference to that. But also, I felt like I was more parody films made me more knowledgeable about Hollywood history, which is interesting. At least I'm just a curious person, so I just want to go down that route. It wasn't years later until I saw like those films, but still, I was intrigued and kind of knew a little bit about those films, even without having seen them.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of like the parody films, like with as you mentioned, Hot Shots, Top Secret. I know that's a movie a lot of people don't really know of, but Top Secret with Val Kilmer, Airplane, the Naked Gun films. I mean, Leslie Nielsen. I mean, he was the king of parody films. Like,
he was absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. No, those are funny. Those are really, really funny. Now, I want to ask you. I'll start with you, George, and then I'll go to Josh. Because of the history between DreamWorks and Disney, right? Because Katzenberg left, he was kind of, from what I understand, he was kind of shut. He wanted a bigger role at Disney. Michael Eisner said no, and he walked, right? So there's a little bit of sour grapes. I'm probably underestimating it. There's probably a lot of sour grapes, but essentially that's what it was.
There was when that Ants movie came out.
Definitely, and that's what I'm kind of getting to here. So what do you think, George? What do you think about that, right? That DreamWorks versus Disney thing, where it's like, because Katzenberg wasn't shy about this stuff. Like, I mean, it's well known that he modeled Shrek after Michael Eisner. Okay. And the whole thing with, I know you're going to talk about it with the Bugs Life and Ants and stuff. What are your thoughts on that whole kind of feud? It seems like it's over now because Katzenberg's not even involved anymore. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and as a child, you really don't think of that, but it actually, I think that was kind of, in a way, Katzenberg's goal was to kind of get kids to kind of maneuver over to the other side, if you will, as Dr. Facilier would say it. Because at that moment when they were kind of like promoting and marketing both movies, as a young kid, it was like I could see like the differences in the somewhat of the animation style, but in that moment I'm thinking, wait, is this one of the same movies? Like, is this just a different preview? And then it wasn't until that I actually had seen where it actually said the title, and it said, Disney Pixar's A Bug's Life and DreamWorks Ants. And I thought, oh, this is two separate animated films. I'm thinking, why in the world would they do two movies? Because again, as a kid, you don't really think of the logistics behind it, like, between studios. But as I gotten older, and I start to like do like research and again, here's my Princess and the Frog. Dig a little deeper again. I'm throwing out Princess and the Frog.
Disney's gonna have to start sending you checks, bro.
I know. Geez, I'm like cross promoting this thing like crazy. but then I realized, you know, how DreamWorks was conceived and what have you, and what happened with Katzenberg between the Walt Disney Company. And I just put two and two together, and I thought, okay, this really makes sense. And it wasn't until when YouTube started becoming a big deal where people were kind of diving into the movie nostalgia and what have you, and it basically confirmed what I started to believe. It was like, okay, this is definitely a dig to Disney and Pixar, because at that time it was like, you know, A Bug's Life was like kind of already in like pre-production and what have you around, you know, and then Katzenberg leaving, and it's just like he kind of took like the overall kind of assumption of like, and just threw like this story together, and it's like, okay, you know, we're going to go head to head, you know, it's going to be released around the same time anyway. And so, and then as you had mentioned with Shrek, you know, they really like play on to like the Disney fairy tales and what have you. And then, you know, they kind of, you know, modeled Shrek after a certain CEO, but threw a little Mike Myers into it. You know, it's like,
you know, and you know what, not to interrupt you, George, I'll let you continue in just a second. I just want to say real quick too, before I forget, it's kind of perfect in a way that Universal ended up with DreamWorks, because Universal is also seen in a lot of ways as the anti-Disney, right? They kind of the edgier version, like, and I think that the Shrek movie and the kind of making fun of fairy tales things works very well with the Universal kind of image as well, because Universal takes jabs at Disney and their theme
they
parks.
do all the time. They do it on they do it on social media. They do it on through like their promotional commercials. It's like they actually have a child staring into a camera saying, I want more to a vacation than just seeing princesses. Right. And it's like, wow. Like, again, just like how you said, like where Katzenberg made it known, you know, these digs were at Disney were the same thing with Universal. You know, they don't hold back. Like, they just say it like right on. So yeah, it was a kind of like a nice blended marriage, so to speak, between Universal and DreamWorks.
No, and I really applauded that move, actually, because I was very critical. I still am very critical. I think Universal, they're improving, but I think they do need to step up their in-house IP. They rely a lot on outside IP. But when they bought DreamWorks, I'm like, that's perfect. That's perfect for Universal, because DreamWorks was kind of seen as the edgier kind of animation house. You know, it fit that Universal wheelhouse very nice.
Now, kind of fast forwarding to like today's time, and this is what kind of bothers me a bit, like with these animation studios, because now a lot of the animation styles are kind of looking similar to each other. You know, there's a lot of times where it's like you can't identify Disney and Pixar from DreamWorks and Illuminations. They all kind of have like that same kind of style, and they're going to that that kind of slapstick. Which, now, when I say this, I don't mean that you can't have an animated film to be like slapstick and kind of quirky and fun, but it's like when you do that with every single animated film, it kind of dilutes the integrity of like why you're making that film. And even to certain aspects of Moana, you know, I know OG, you're kind of big on like the metaverse type of thing, where it's like, yeah, where Maui mentions like, you know, I just made a tweet, you know, and it's like, you know, how long does that even going to say? I mean, it's not even called Twitter anymore. I mean, we still call it Twitter, but it's like, but I mean, a child 30 years down the road, if they go back and watch Moana, are they going to understand what is he talking about? What's a tweet? You know?
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Now, Josh, I'm going to go to you. What do you think about the DreamWorks Disney war, the Katzenberg stuff with the Michael Eisner, you know, modeling Shrek after him, things like that, Ants and Bugs Life? What are your thoughts on that whole thing?
So I grew up first and foremost being a Disney kid, right? Like, I enjoyed other things. I watched Nickelodeon's Nicktoons. I watched like a bunch of other stuff, but like when it came to animation, I thought, like probably many people, the prestigious animation of America was Disney. It's above anything else that's going on. And the Renaissance proved that, like growing up in that time period. But when DreamWorks came around, as a challenger brand, I guess if you want to get into businessy terms, as a challenger brand, it's all right to kind of punch up. It's never all right to punch down. And I don't think Disney's family-friendly vibe would people would hate the fact that Disney was punching down on Universal or DreamWorks. So they don't, which suits their brand. But the fact that DreamWorks could punch up because they were second place or just the new guy in town, and setting themselves up to be a bit edgier, the same with Universal, and attaching themselves to Universal, it really worked out for them. And even in the landscape of all of the people that are doing animation now, because I think what DreamWorks did was it set up where we're at now, where you can have 4 or 5 different major American studios all making quality animation. It's not just Disney anymore, which is great. I mean, I love that. To George's note, and they all kind of look the same. That definitely was the case, I think, for a long time. And I think we're starting to get out of that now. You know, when we're looking at like the newest Puss in Boots film, it feels a little bit different. You know, things like that. Or like when you go over to Sony and you look at like what they're doing with all the Spider-Verse stuff, like it looks very different.
Or even Wish has a different style, right?
Wish has a different style. Pixar has been constantly experimenting with different styles in their short cartoons. So that's all good. But I think that it's cool to see the animation industry explode. And I think that's thanks to DreamWorks, you know, being able to kind of come out of Katzenberg leaving Disney, setting up something with a bunch of money behind it because it came from Geffen and Spielberg as well. And people believing in it, because I think that somebody needed to be the anti-Disney.
And it does work. It really does work with their kind of animation style and storyline and characters. You know, we're watching Ants, like I could never see the stuff that they used in that movie put into Bug's Life. I mean, especially like at the bar scene when you have Woody Allen as an ant and saying, you know, I have a thing about drinking from an anus out of another bug. You know, it's like,
right.
Like that's something you would never hear coming from like a Disney Pixar's, but it's like, and at that time, like coming like as an animation movie, you know, I'm watching that and it's like, I didn't understand like what that even it meant, but it was like, then as I got older, I was like, okay, so there's like a lot of like edgier stuff here. And, but it fits that tone. And it's like, I'm glad, you know, they kind of had, I mean, no one likes a fallout, but I mean, I'm glad that it was like, it had to be where it took him to abruptly leave the Walt Disney Company to be able to make DreamWorks upon, you know, with Spielberg and what have you. Like it was all kind of perfect timing, because I can never see the style and route that Katzenberg wanted to go with Disney animation. It just wouldn't have fit. So it's like, I would rather him go do his own thing. And even still to this day, you know, give Disney a run for their money, because again, healthy competition is a good thing.
Yeah, and things work out like that sometimes, right? Like this, at the moment, it seems like a really shitty situation with like even Walt Disney with Oswald. You know, they took, I think it was Universal who took Oswald from him, right? And he was, that was a terrible time for him. But at the end, though, it really worked out because that led to Mickey Mouse, which is a massive success. Same could be said about Katzenberg, right? Okay, it sucks. In the moment, you know, you were overlooked for a higher position. You have to leave Disney, you know, this animation house that you helped rebuild, right? And now you got to leave. But it kind of worked out better for Katzenberg in a way, because then he can put his imprint on a brand new animation house. You know, this is Katzenberg's studio, really, you know? So it's fascinating. In terms of the animation, like styles, it was kind of interesting with CGI, because we were kind of like in this arms race to get as real as possible. All these studios were like trying to get more real, more real, more real. We kind of got to a point with the realism where it's like, we get any more real, this is going to be live action, you know?
Right.
So there came a point where I think they realized like, okay, we've kind of maxed out where we can go with the technology. Let's have fun now, and let's dabble and play in other styles. And I love that. I absolutely love that. I still haven't seen Wish, full disclosure. I am planning on seeing it. But even if I don't like Wish, I appreciate the fact that Disney went in a different direction with the style. I want to see Disney really dabble in a lot of different art art styles, you know, and not just do the same thing over and over again. Go ahead, George.
And this has like really nothing to do with the conversation, but because you brought up Wish, I thought it was very clever. And you'll catch it, OG, because you're a stickler for that kind of stuff, where you find like the Easter eggs and stuff. But I love the introduction to Wish, of how it actually starts off, where it kind of pays tribute to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but then it moves into Wish's own kind of introduction, so to speak. And you'll catch it right away. You'll see exactly how they do it. It was actually very clever, I think.
Interesting. Josh, I want to ask you. So DreamWorks, they got bought out by Universal a few years ago. It's been a while actually now. What's your take on that? You think I personally think Universal has done a really good job with that studio. I think they've done actually a really, really good job with it. Do you think, in your opinion though, do you think that they've handled it well? Do you think they've kind of continued the tradition of what Katzenberg and all them set up? Or have they kind of gone in a completely different direction? Like, what do you feel about the Universal years?
I think it's fine as it. I would say that there's not as much of a distinction. Like when you look at Disney over the course of its lifetime, depending on who was running the company at that time, or you know, you go back to Disney's time, and you're like, yeah, Disney could have probably made a version of Beauty and the Beast, which they had planned. But like the Eisner time period of Beauty and the Beast feels like that time period of Beauty and the Beast. Or I would say that, Jennifer Lee's version of Disney specifically being a bit more culturally aware, socially aware, things like that would not have existed in Eisner's time. Right. Pixar, I think, kind of is the same as DreamWorks. You don't really notice, unless somebody were to point it out to you, you would never really know when Pixar got purchased by Disney. And I feel like the same kind of goes for Universal. I feel like because Katzenberg was pretty much there since the beginning, he was there since the beginning, but even when he wasn't there, it still feels like they're carrying on. I mean, they're still making Boss Baby stuff. They're still making How to Train Your Dragon. It's not like those properties went away. And I think the DreamWorks is fine as it kind of is. It's become more of an IP builder than it is like I'm looking forward to the new DreamWorks animated film. It's like I'm looking forward to that 5th Shrek whenever that comes out, and I think that Universal has been able to use those properties to their advantage in the theme parks and in merchandising, and things like that. And Universal getting in bed with Illumination, bringing that on as like a secondary company to work with. I mean, it only benefits Universal. And like with Illumination, I don't think that you can point at some of the differences between DreamWorks and Illumination. They both kind of feel really similar. Although I would say that DreamWorks tends to use more contemporary music. It tends to feel a bit more contemporary, whereas Illumination kind of plays more on the timelessness, going back to the Disney idea.
It's interesting too with Universal how because when they took on DreamWorks, it opened a whole new world really for that studio, because now look what they're doing with these properties. I mean, look, they're doing a whole land over there at Epic Universe with How to Train Your Dragon, Isle of Berk, right? Well, good shit. I mean, look, I get it. Like a company, maybe even Universal themselves, could have picked up various properties, made a deal with DreamWorks and what have you. But the fact now that DreamWorks is fully owned by Universal, they can really go all in on DreamWorks in the parks, and that opens a whole thing for that whole studio, which is something that it likely wouldn't have seen if Universal didn't buy them. Now, look, I understand like there are certain things. I do think they you know, they might have made, I think even before they bought them, they had certain deal. I think Shrek 4D, things like that, but it wouldn't be as accelerated like it is now. And I think that's exciting. I really do. Go ahead, George. I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
No, you're good, bro. I wanted to ask you both, because Josh, you had mentioned about with like Shrek 5 and what have you. And kind of now they're still having this kind of revival of Shrek, so to speak, where they're kind of incorporating it in the parks and what have you. And then soon to be Shrek 5. You know, Shrek was at a point of time where, you know, it was at a hype of on its own. And then you have like us, you know, growing up where like we look back at it and we say, hey, you know what? We grew up with Shrek. You know, we remember seeing the movies and what have you. Do you guys feel necessarily by making a Shrek 5, it would kind of play on to a newer generation of people to look back and say, you know what, hey, you know, let's dive back into the Shrek franchise, you know, or what have you? Or do you feel like that is just a kind of like doing like a Shrek 5 kind of like for our generation, so to speak?
I don't think Shrek 5 either, if it ever comes out, but if it does, I don't think it'll work. I think that Shrek is such a unique property because for a younger generation, their interaction with Shrek is typically through meme culture, not through the films. So they don't have this like prestigious feeling about Shrek. And I also don't think like the millennial generation that grew up with Shrek, having seen it in theaters, you know, in their teens or younger, I don't think it appeals to them either. I think that for the most part, again, Disney and Pixar for mostly are the brands that people feel really loyal to. I don't know a person who's 35 that feels like Shrek is the thing they've been clamoring for. You know, nor do I think anything from DreamWorks is something that they've been clamoring for. I think that if DreamWorks gave them something really interesting and new, they might be into it. But DreamWorks right now, I think as they are, has really found a good place for the tween or right before tween. So like the maybe 8 to like 12-year-old demographic with like the Trolls movies or the How to Train Your Dragon, like that new land that they're going to open at Epic Universe feels perfect for like a 12-13-year-old that grew up watching those films. It doesn't feel like a land, even though it's an interesting land, right? Like if you were to say what kind of medieval type of land would a millennial want that is not Harry Potter, almost everybody I know would probably say Lord of the Rings. Our last choice would probably be How to Train Your Dragon, or very few people would say How to Train Your Dragon. And so I think that DreamWorks and Illumination both, I feel like, have found their demographic being a younger demographic. The sequels kind of cater to that, but the sequels have to be from things that I think that they grew up with. I think even like the Madagascar characters are almost too old for a younger generation to attach themselves to, because they're not as timeless as a lot of the Disney stuff. So Shrek 5, I just don't think will ever manifest or work if it does.
I agree with you. Shrek 5, Despicable Me 78, you know, it's like
78. Yeah, right. I tell you though, Minions are not my cup of tea at all, but they make so much money. I think the
Minions do really well as like a logo. They're a really good mascot.
That's interesting. It's actually a good way of putting it, Josh. So yeah, you're right. They're kind of like almost like, what would you say? Like almost like a Mickey Mouse, maybe, you know?
Mickey Mouse didn't make a new cartoon for decades, right? Or very rarely made a new cartoon. Like since from the 1950s to like the mid 2010s, there were like 3 Mickey Mouse shorts in that time period. But Mickey Mouse merchandise sold like gangbusters because people attach Mickey Mouse with Disney's brand in the same way that I think if you look at a Minion, you can't help but think Universal Illumination. And I think that's where they are with the Despicable Me franchise at this point.
Smart. Yeah, I would agree with you on that. That's a great way. That's a great perspective. I never considered that, but you're right. It's more of a mascot than anything else. Interesting. Well, gentlemen, it was fantastic talking DreamWorks with you, talking Disney animation overall. Really, really good time. Josh, it's always a pleasure having you on and getting your perspective on things. We do appreciate you coming on and joining us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I had a great time talking about weird, nerdy animation stuff that I rarely get to talk to other people about. So it's great.
Absolutely. We'll have you on again. We'll talk studio stuff or even theme park stuff, absolutely. But if you can remind everybody where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube. I'm posting videos. I try to post videos like every 2 weeks these days. I just dropped a video about how Hollywood has been basically dismantled by streaming services. And so a lot of kind of behind the scenes business there. I'm working on a video currently about the eras of live action Disney. I'm in the Touchstone era currently, so that'll be the next video. So if you're interested in hearing about Splash or Ernest movies or things like that, I'll be making a video and having that out pretty soon as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a friend, George, right? Mary Ann, who would love. Yeah, she's into the nostalgia and the '90s stuff. So we'll definitely send your videos her way. She'll love it. Sweet. She'll love it. And the Italiano, if you could let everybody at home know where they can find you on social media.
Absolutely. You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on Instagram under the Disney Italiano. And of course, you'll find me here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
There it is. Comment down below, everybody, with all your thoughts on everything we discussed today. DreamWorks, the studio that it started as, the studio that it ultimately ended up as. DreamWorks versus Disney, the Katzenberg stuff. We would love to hear from you. Comment down below. And as always, have a wonderful, wonderful day.